Hey everybody, Brandon Vigliarolo with the Register, and I'm here today with Robin Wilton, Director for Internet Trust at the Internet Society, to talk about the tug-of-war going on between law enforcement and the tech industry on end-to-end encryption in messaging apps. Robin, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation, Brandon.
Yeah, of course. So, the most recent end-to-end encryption news, I think, has probably been Europol's letter that came out in opposition to the practice, unsurprisingly. Right? I think there was one signed by the UK and several other countries last year that basically made very similar arguments. And you mentioned previously that this effort by Europol is pretty much these are the same old tired arguments. So, is there nothing new in the law enforcement opposition to end-to-end encryption in this particular letter?
I didn't see anything new in this letter. I mean, looking at it, look at it this way: if it was a Wikipedia article, it would be twice as long because it would be full of little brackets that said citation needed. It was a lot of statements and kind of assertions, but it was pretty thin on evidence. I mean, yeah. Even if you look at something like they say, "Oh, we want security by design." Well, okay, but as it stands in the letter, that's just a soundbite. It's not
right.
It's not a technical spec, is it? It's not a design spec. So it was a bit thin. And as you say, I think it fell back on the old arguments that have been largely discredited over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Right. That kind of shocked me when I read it too. I was like, this strikes me as incredibly similar to what was the group? It was what was the group called? The Virtual Global Task Force, I think, that wrote the letter last year, right? And that was, I think, the CMA participated in that one too. And it was like you said, very similar arguments. There was nothing really new here. It was about, it seemed like sound bites about protecting children, all this kind of stuff, right? And I know Europol doesn't specifically mention in its letter, but it does state in the press release, right, that Meta seems to be like the central antagonist here, right? They're really concerned about Meta adding end-to-end encryption in their platform. Right. I understand one of the big differences between Meta's implementation and some of the ones that other companies use is client-side scanning for objectionable content is not permitted under Meta's end-to-end encryption in messaging, I believe, which seems to be the big sticking point for these different international police groups. I mean, is Meta really going above and beyond here in terms of what their end-to-end encryption model is, or are they just getting picked on because they're recently implementing it globally?
Yeah, it's really tough to tease that apart. Certainly, if you spoke to Signal, for example, and we had Meredith Whittaker gave a fantastic keynote at our recent symposium on network security. They would definitely deny strenuously that client-side scanning plays any part in their system. And I think most developers and providers of end-to-end encryption would say that actually client-side scanning is anathema to them. I mean, right, which kind of made Facebook's touting of this as almost kind of a surprise to me too, right? Like you're not allowed client-side scanning. Well, is anyone else doing that either? Well, right, and then there's the timing aspect to this. Okay, so if you look back, I mean, so the late and much missed Ross Anderson, who tragically died far too soon just recently, wrote a fantastic paper on chat control, as he called it, and he said if you look back to about 2015, and you look at the proliferation of available end-to-end encrypted messaging services and apps since then, you'd kind of expect that if those were an insuperable obstacle to law enforcement, that somehow the number of arrests for illegal images would have dropped off the cliff, but it hasn't. It has pretty much remained constant.
Right.
So I think it's very hard to believe this assertion that actually that the rollout of end-to-end encrypted messaging, which has been going apace the last 10 years because people are concerned about their online privacy, that it actually is the meaningful obstacle to law enforcement. I think you have to look somewhere else if you want to find out why haven't those rates changed? Why haven't they gone up for a start?
Right.
And so, I mean, again, a few years ago, I know Susan Landau, another one of my heroes, did some research interviewing US law enforcement. And one of the people she interviewed said, actually, the technology of encryption is not the obstacle here. He said, I've got a box full of handsets in the next room, but we don't have the cables and the skill to connect them and get the information off. So that wasn't about encryption. That was about basic police capabilities which you could improve without even raising the topic of encryption. So I think there's a huge
and like even
focus there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Meta even said the same thing. They were like, "Look, we've been reporting more, harmful content in our messaging. Even with encryption in place, we have behavioral algorithms. We have all these different things that can clue us into maybe something going on. Right? There's no need to get into these encrypted messages and sacrifice a few people's privacy, right, for what might end up being minimal benefit." And so I was kind of thinking about, I was thinking about this almost in terms of like a. The fight is, but I feel like maybe the law enforcement is kind of going about this at the wrong angle, or maybe it's just that I feel like the discussion between law enforcement and these companies isn't meeting in the middle, right? I feel like law enforcement's like, we need some way to ensure we see these messages, and these companies are like, well, no, we don't want to give that to you, right? Because that this just seems like, like even Meta, right, saying that they value their customers' privacy, right? It's kind of surprising given Meta's privacy standards, but I feel like this is an easy way for companies to basically wash their hands of, this fear that people are being snooped on, right? Like, is any company in their right mind, going to actually oppose this given it's their reputation for user protection on the line?
Right, and I think that was also visible, for example, in Apple's position after San Bernardino, and they said, look, you're asking us to re-engineer our products. We declined to do that because our value proposition is one based on the privacy of the individual. And you can, depending on the company, you can take that as much at face value as you wish, because they will all be driven by a commercial incentive. So I think what you've highlighted there is in a face-to-face between commerce and law enforcement, each of them is standing on their own hilltop yelling their perspective. But when you look at end-to-end encryption, there are actually a number of other valid stakeholders in the picture. For example, I mean, yes, public safety is a factor, but so are the fundamental rights of the individuals, including the children who law enforcement claim to want to protect. They are fully fledged holders of the full set of rights, not just objects of protection to be mothballed and wrapped in cotton wool. And I think when you start to look at that broader set of stakeholders, you can see that actually this push by law enforcement is a very one-sided thing. Now, I heard someone from law enforcement say, law enforcement will always push for better tools and more resources. And so they should, because they've got a job to do and they should be asking for the best tools to do the job. But he said, the question of whether they should be given those tools or not is a political one. It's not a law enforcement one. And that means you have to bring in the societal dimensions, the national security dimensions, and so on. And I mean, national security, it's weird. In the UK, for example, I have a growing list of national security and intelligence professionals who have said, don't mess with encryption. It does far more good than it does harm. And if you start messing with it, you're actually making things worse for us, national security and cybersecurity. And actually stepping back from their position, if you think about it, you're making life worse for law enforcement too. If you weaken everyone's protection, you're basically creating a petri dish in which more crime can happen. And that,
absolutely. Yeah. Right. Like there's a huge, general cybersecurity component to this, right? And that it's if we weaken these things, right, and then we have another incident like all these hackers gaining access to Microsoft systems, right, then we're easily going to have, messages spilling out into the ether that might have national security concern. I mean, had end-to-end encryption been in place in those instances, right, these executive department emails wouldn't have been viewable by foreign governments. Yeah. But,
I've been trying to, so I working for IBM in the, from the mid 80s to the late 90s, from 95 onwards was trying to get encrypted email into the product line. And I'm just amazed that all our email basically goes still unencrypted.
Right. Unless you actually seek out an encrypted email service, right? Yeah. You're pretty much opening yourself to that. Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think with laws like the UK's, online safety bill getting passed? I mean, do you think this battle is going in law enforcement's favor? Is the company tipping the scale for law enforcement when it comes to laws getting passed?
When it comes to laws getting passed, there have certainly been some bad examples. I think there was some good pushback against the European equivalent on child abuse late last year, but I think in the UK, sadly, that pushback has not been listened to. And as a result, not just the Online Safety Act, we've now got amendments to the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, which even back then was considered to be over-intrusive, is now being made more intrusive and giving, for instance, the Home Secretary, a tech company that wants to improve the security of its products has to tell the Home Secretary, the UK Home Secretary first. And the Home Secretary can say, oh, look at it and say, oh, well, no, actually, that would infringe on some of our ability to access people's communications, so I'm not going to let you do it. I mean, how does that work for a non-UK corporation?
It sounds like royal assent to me, right? I mean,
that's one declines, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So who are we to say that? I find it hard to see how that gets put into practice. And the idea that a company can be actually effectively prevented from not just from introducing new security stuff, but also from fixing bugs. If law enforcement had been relying on a bug for access, and that bug is discovered and patched, that would fall under the category of things that the Home Secretary can say no to. And so that would result in people being left with an insecure product if they were in the UK, which is bad enough for us, selfishly. But then think of the impact on, I don't know, an example I used a while back was, imagine you've got a family in Ukraine that's in a war zone, they've got split up, but thank goodness they've got their mobiles and they're using secure messaging to try and get together again. They are actually, their communications are actually more secure in that situation than if one of them is trying to talk to someone in the UK. How absurd is that? We're actually we're at risk of making the UK the weak link in online security and communications, and that's not something any national government should be aiming for.
No, absolutely not. So, I mean, given that, right, at least in the UK and maybe some other countries around the world that have passed similar rules, I'm not sure what the international standing is, but I mean, how do you think this fight is going, right? I mean, is end-to-end encryption is good, widespread end-to-end encryption something we're going to achieve, or are we looking at a losing fight right now, given the current circumstances?
I don't see how you can actually stop the move towards more and more pervasive encryption. And I say that not just from the point of view of encrypted messaging, but think of the number of connected things that we're surrounded by now. Okay, I mean, I've got an app on my iPad that will tell me if I left the car unlocked, and it will let me lock it again. But that control message goes from my iPad through something run by the car manufacturer and hosted on, I don't know, some cloud service, through to the vehicle. So, and it's really important, obviously, that the manufacturer has a legitimate place in that route, but there's no way they should be allowed to intercept or tamper or forge those control messages. So that really needs end-to-end encryption between my iPad and the car, regardless of who else it goes through. Otherwise, my life's at stake. Someone could turn the car off when I'm on the motorway, whatever. So if you look at a world where end-to-end encryption is absolutely necessary in that kind of case, and then say, oh well, no, it's okay, we're going to legislate for a world in which it's present there, but it's absent from messaging, I think that's just wishful thinking. The technology's out there, it's available in open source. People will implement it. So but basically it's a Pandora's box, right? I mean, it's out, it's a thing that exists. You're not going to be able to legislate it away. Hopefully not, at least. Well, and it doesn't just exist; it's actually necessary and desirable.
Right? Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I mean, hopefully the inevitability of a widely encrypted society is just that, inevitable, right? Well, Robin, thanks so much for joining me today.
You're most welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I hope we can talk about future developments in end-to-end encryption soon. And in the meantime, you can read about them on the Register.